Russia is currently launching its most extensive drone attacks against Ukraine to date, every few days. Just on Wednesday, it sent 728 drones, including dummies or decoy drones. That's significantly more than the previous record last week. And at the same time, Donald Trump in Washington is sending mixed messages. Will he continue supporting Ukraine militarily? Won't he? Well, we'll discuss all that on today's show, which is in a way a Berlin briefing plus a Baltic briefing. We've got a great guest in our studio, the Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Estonia. So that's that small Baltic country that shares a border with Russia. Very much looking forward to your insights. Thank you very much, Jonatan. And we also have a Ukraine briefing. My colleague Roman Goncharenko is here from DW's Russian service, who produces a great podcast in the Russian language, a Geofactor. So if you speak Russian, do check that out. And over on the line, we have Christian Mölling, one of Germany's most renowned security experts. He's a senior advisor with the European Policy Center. Thank you very much for joining us. We want to start, Roman, with the situation on the ground. I just said so many drones that Russia is sending. What exactly is happening? Where are those drones flying to? How is Ukraine defending itself?
Well, exactly. This is the new thing. So Russia continues its war of attrition, moving slowly but steadily westwards, taking one village after another. So the Ukrainians are trying to slow down that process, but they are outnumbered still and outgunned. What's really new is, as you've just mentioned, those drone attacks. So they have intensified in the past weeks, I would say. So Russia is sending much more drones and missiles on Ukrainian cities deep inside Ukrainian territory, hitting the capital Kyiv, but also hitting towns far away in the west of Ukraine, closer to the NATO and European Union border. And the targets are industrial objects, but also civilian residential areas. So the aim is terror, as simple as that. And the other aim is to deplete Ukrainian air defense. And the effect is that more and more, we see more and more casualties on the Ukrainian side. We see the capital Kyiv burning, flames of smoke rising. So those are pictures that are having a very strong impact on the Ukrainian population. So there is not maybe so much damage, of course damage is there, but it's also the power of the pictures. This is what Russia is trying to do.
Christian, you've observed Russia's attacks against Ukraine for a very long time. How do you explain that that is happening now, when at the same time Donald Trump is saying that peace negotiations are still possible?
Yeah, I think that obviously the Kremlin is pretty sure that it can continue and intensify. So it has created the capacity by increasing the production of the Shahed drones. And now it can, and there's no reason to believe that Donald Trump would get so angry that he would really do something bad to the Kremlin and force them into a bad situation, obviously. Otherwise, it's not explainable that after the telephone call between Donald Trump and Russian President Putin, exactly the strongest attacks in that night afterwards came down on Ukraine and Kiev. So obviously the Kremlin thinks they have a carte blanche.
And Jonatan, how are you watching that, and how do you feel? Is Europe reacting enough? Is everybody taking that seriously enough? What's your position?
So I think we've been on the right path, but not moving fast enough. I mean, for us, this is existential. It's existential. And as a northerner, I'm not using that word lightly. It's existential because of two reasons. First, Putin hasn't changed any of his goals. He wants all of Ukraine, but not just Ukraine. A fundamental reshaping of European security architecture with a buffer zone carved out on his western borders that would consist of us and many others. That's reason number one. The other reason, obviously, relates to the fundamental norms of international life that are shaped by the outcome of big wars and will be shaped by the outcome of this war. And if we find ourselves in a situation where Ukraine is condemned to limited sovereignty because of its location or because of what Moscow says, when we find ourselves in a situation where certain borders in Europe have been changed with military force, with the rest of the continent accepting this as de facto legitimate, then which border remains secure? And if Ukraine is condemned to limited sovereignty, then where do we draw the line? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Sweden, Poland, Germany? Where? And this is as big as it gets. We're not worried because of proximity to the fighting. We're no closer to the war zone than Berlin is. We are next to Russia, but it's eerily quiet on our borders. One day this war will be over, and then the peace that will follow will be shaped by how this war ends. So when we look at what the Russians are doing today, we're seeing this strategy play out itself against civilian targets. This is not just blind brutality. This is part of a strategy to undermine the hope of the Ukrainian people that their choice of one day living a normal European future is still viable. So we need to be providing hope. As Russia destroyed it, we need to be providing it. We need to provide Ukraine with more than just missiles and howitzers and ammunition. We need to demonstrate that when we said that Ukraine is part of the European family, that we actually meant it, and that although the path may take them considerable time, they are nevertheless moving step by step closer to that future. So we're having a very pragmatic outlook on the war, but also on our security, on European security. No one is afraid, but everybody is focused.
But you said we don't just have to supply them with those howitzers, etc., but it has to start with those weapons, right? But that is something where Europeans are currently wondering, is Donald Trump on the same page? Because last week, essentially the Pentagon announced that it will stop Ukraine's military support. And then we had a very interesting conversation by reporters with Donald Trump. Maybe we can just listen to that, because Donald Trump then sounded very annoyed with Russian President Vladimir Putin and seemed to then change his mind about military support for Ukraine. Let's just listen to that again.
We're not happy with Putin. I'm not happy with Putin. I can tell you that much right now, because he's killing a lot of people. And a lot of them are his soldiers and their soldiers, mostly. And it's now up to 7,000 a week. And I'm not happy with Putin. We get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin, for you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
So who ordered the pause last week?
I don't know. What did you tell me?
Who ordered the pause last week? Jonatan, you were ambassador of Estonia during Trump's first presidency. What did we just see there?
So I think we're seeing American politics play itself out quite publicly. I mean, we're all watching what's happening, not only with regard to America's foreign policy, but also with regard to America's domestic affairs. You know, when we think about the United States, and we're a very close ally of the United States, who are part of the U.S. relationship is a core pillar of our security policy, as I think it is for many Europeans. We're extremely transatlantic minded. But when we look at what's happening in the world today, our suggestion is to behave as if the Americans have already pulled down their support for European security. Paradoxically, that also is the best way to keep the Americans engaged. This is what our American friends tell us. The time of going to Washington and asking for things is over. Now we need to demonstrate European capability, ability, political will, the fact that we have our own skin in the game, and then go to Washington and tell them the things that we've done, and then see if they would be willing to join us. So for us, in practical terms, there really is no dilemma. The things that we would have to do if the Americans were to withdraw are the very same things we today have to do to keep them engaged. And that's spend more on defense, ensure that we stand on our own 2 feet. We come up with European constructs, European guarantees for Ukraine, and we provide European assistance to Ukraine. Now, we may not be able to fill every gap that there might be if the Americans were to seriously withdraw, but we're going to have to do our best instead of going to Washington and trying to convince them all.
But aren't you already doing much more than, for example, Germany? Because you are giving more to Ukraine compared to your economic possibilities. You have a larger ratio of your army compared with your population. So what more could you do?
So we're extremely happy with the trajectory that Germany seems to have taken. We've said for years now we need more Germany. We've said this as Estonians, we've said this as Europeans. We need more Germany, more German buy-in, not only with regard to European security in general, but also in Ukraine. So we're very proud of the fact that we're contributing a significant percentage of our GDP towards defense. We're going to be above 5% proper defense spending next year. Also, a significant amount of our GDP is allocated to Ukraine. 3% of our population now is Ukrainian refugees, whom we have welcomed in our economy, in our homes. We're very proud of what we've done, but we're also very happy with what Germany is doing. Now, is this enough? No. As I said earlier, we need to move faster. The worst thing for us to do is put ourselves in a situation where 6 months or a year from today, we look back at today and start our sentences with we should have or we could have. Let's not take those risks. The Russians aren't 10 feet tall. Putin is running on fumes. He is hurting. But this is a big enough war to be taken seriously. So if in doubt, then spend more on defense, on security, on assisting Ukraine.
And I would like to get Christian's perspective on this because, Jonatan, you just said, we've been waiting for a strong Germany when it comes to Ukraine for a long time. And Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, is actually somebody who says, OK, we do need to throw everything in. Let's listen to that clip. And then, Christian, I want your perspective. What Friedrich Merz said this week in the German parliament, because, of course, he's facing criticism as well from an increasingly strong and loud criticism from the far left and the far right when it comes to supporting Ukraine militarily. So he addresses those fringes in Parliament this week. Let's listen.
We will continue to help Ukraine, even against the resistance of the political left and the Russia-friendly right here in the House. We will continue this support. And let me make it even clearer. The means of diplomacy have been exhausted.
So, Christian, Germany announced earlier, a couple of weeks ago, that it was going to support Ukrainian weapons production with some 5 billion euros. What is the substance of Germany's military support as we speak? And are they acting fast enough if what Jonatan said is coming into reality, a scenario where the US suddenly says, right, I've changed my mind again. Putin is my friend again, and I'll just focus my attention elsewhere.
Last thing could easily happen. I mean, we have seen that policy change is kind of the daily thing in Washington right now. And it was foreseeable that there was a high risk that Donald Trump would basically be back in office. So, I mean, from a German perspective, if you look back when the so-called Zeitenwende started here, so the declaration by the then Chancellor Olaf Scholz, it was a powerful speech, and we knew that it would take us 2 years from day one, if we would have started from day one on, to really get industry going and really produce what we need. Now we are in year 4, so we basically missed many of the opportunities, and we are starting.
It's what Jonatan just said. We shouldn't be in a situation where we say we should have done this or that, right?
Yeah, but I think you basically have to. That's fair first of all from a point of view of a diplomat, and taking a view over Europe. But I'm sitting in my country. I think it's important to see this because it's really frustrating, and it shows that time is really running out. And that is the look into the future, is that we now have only 4 years left with regards to the own framework that this government has set itself to bring us up to speed. So we will see a lot of things, hopefully, in the next weeks and months that will act in parallel. You already get the impression there's a lot of things happening. The question is there a good plan behind it? I can't tell you. I hope so. But what we get currently from the government is, on the one hand, very encouraging with regards to the language that comes from the government. At the same time, the kind of how do you operationalize all this is still a little bit fuzzy, because yes, we are getting a lot of money, but this money could have been freed already. The now defense minister is the oldest minister in office of the new government. So he basically knows his dossier. So we are all waiting for him to declare what the level of ambition is and how he would like to shape the next 4 years, and really making Germany not only the biggest conventional army, not sure that's the important thing, but how to deliver security in a way that really deters Russia and supports our allies, and especially Ukraine. This is something we're still missing.
And Roman, I would like to ask you about Russia's reaction to Donald Trump's ambiguous messaging, shall we say, because Russia is also confused about who they're dealing with in the White House. So how did they react? And is that potentially something that is beneficial to Europeans? Is that buying them some time, that it's not as predictable as an American President Joe Biden, who was very, very clear when he said, I'm standing by Ukraine's side?
Well, Russia has been reacting, but I would say it is a very reserved reaction so far, because Russia is still hoping to have some kind of a deal with Donald Trump. So we are expecting probably a meeting between the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the State Secretary Marco Rubio. Yes, Russia is still working on a meeting between Trump and Putin. So they still haven't given up that hope. And of course, Putin hopes that he will then persuade Trump to put more pressure on Ukraine, maybe withhold weapons again, because this is a precondition for a ceasefire. So all we are talking about at the moment is a ceasefire that would last a couple of weeks. So far, those attempts have failed, but there is still work there. And Russia... Of course, Russia was not happy about what Donald Trump said, so the last quote that we've heard. But I think they can swallow it, because they know there are big stakes here. And they've seen that Ukraine is now in a very dire situation, not having enough, first of all, air defense. There are talks between Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky to get additional Patriot air defense systems, which are the best. And it is still not clear whether Trump will say yes, whether there will be enough interceptor missiles. And so far, Russia is bombing Ukraine and then shelling Ukrainian cities, just putting also more pressure on the West, on Donald Trump. And there is hope in Ukraine and in the West that at some point Donald Trump might lose his patience finally and give Ukraine just whatever Ukraine wants. I don't think this will happen. I think Donald Trump is still very cautious. So we've seen a lot of harsh rhetoric. We've seen harsh rhetoric also in the years before towards Russia, but we haven't seen any really hard moves. So maybe he will impose new sanctions, but I don't think those will be those sanctions from hell, as they are sometimes described by Ukrainian senators. U.S. senators, sorry.
And Jonatan, you are a diplomat, so you can probably not agree with Friedrich Merz, who says diplomatic means have been exhausted.
Oh, when it comes to talking to the Russians, I agree 100%. Calling Putin, talking to the Russians today has no positive effect on the strategic picture here. Look, obviously Ukraine is in deep difficulty. The cities are being bombed on a daily basis. That's, I think, more important than what is happening on the front lines, where the front might move a kilometer this way, a kilometer that way. But it's just the grind of living through
everyday life,
every day, every night. I mean, it's usually overnight. What London had to live through during the Blitz. I mean, Kiev is now experiencing this on a daily basis, and not just Kiev. Cities far from the front lines. But let's not fool ourselves into believing that the Russians aren't equally in difficulty. Not in the same way. Their cities are not being bombed. But Putin is running on fumes. I mean, his war was supposed to last a few days, perhaps a few weeks. He was supposed to kick in the door in Kiev, have the body politic there collapse, and then negotiate with the Americans, perhaps with some Europeans, a new European security order. Now, 3 years in, we see all optimism having left Moscow. I mean, the people that matter, the people who control the money and the guns, they have become cynical. Putin has had to tighten screws. The fear has descended on Moscow in ways that, frankly, is unparalleled since the Stalinist days. He has one argument going for him, one cornerstone of his theory of victory, which is that soon the Americans will do a U-turn, and once the Americans do a U-turn, the Europeans will not be able to sustain their course. Now, we obviously need to keep talking to our American friends to ensure that they stay with us, but I think what is totally under our control is what we do as Europeans to demonstrate that even if, and I hope that's not going to be the case, but even if the Americans take a pause, pull down or pull back their support, we will be able to continue. And this, again, relates to not just military assistance, but also, for instance, on the sanctions. So we're working on our next sanctions package. We need to demonstrate that even though we may not have G7 consensus at the moment, we are able to take steps that previously were only considered as G7 decisions, like lowering the oil price gap, which the Europeans could do, like imposing additional harsh sanctions on Russian energy exports. Now, none of these are going to function as a silver bullet. There are no silver bullets in wars. But the target of our policies needs to be that core element in Putin's theory of victory, which is that the Europeans won't be able to remain standing. This is what we need to disprove, not by the speeches that we give. I mean, the speeches are good, but by the action that we undertake. Now, since the early days of the Soviet Union, the Russians have considered the fact that the West is democratic to be a source of our weakness. Our governments change. So this is what Putin points to. Give it time, they will elect a new government, things will change. So we will also have to look for ways to demonstrate the continuity of our policy that would go beyond our electoral cycles. Focus on accountability, the courts of law, the International Criminal Court, but also the special tribunal that we are in the process of establishing under the Council of Europe. This is important in order to shape the sort of future, the sort of peace that we will have once this war ends. But it's also important during the war to convince Moscow that even if there's a change in government in Estonia or in Germany, there are certain things that will continue, that in certain ways Europe has reached a point of no return. And once this becomes plausible enough, I believe the Russians will reconsider their strategy. But only once they reconsider their strategy can we start about engaging them diplomatically. Can it be done? Yes. The very fact that I am sitting here talking to you is proof of that. We were occupied until 1991. The Russians didn't want to withdraw their troops. They only left in 1994. Tallinn was occupied by a division that was then commanded by Valery Gerasimov, the same Gerasimov who is now chief of staff. They didn't want to leave, yet they had to. So the fact that I'm sitting here is proof that it can be done. Some might also say that our goal of pushing Russia back into Russia is too ambitious. Well, if that's too ambitious, then what would a realistic goal be?
And I have a question on goals that might be too ambitious. The German government says that Russia needs to pay for all the damage that it's causing in Ukraine. At the same time, the German government is saying those frozen Russian assets that we've got, some 200 billion euros or so in Europe that are frozen. It's frozen Russian money, where many people are saying, including your country, Estonia, we should use those Russian assets. And the German government so far has said we haven't really found a legally sound enough way to use them. Is that a good enough excuse?
Not in our opinion. We think that there's a way to do this without using a highway robber tactic of just simply tanking it. I mean, the very fact of us freezing those assets is noteworthy in of itself. So if your argument is based on your desire to protect sovereign assets as a function of protecting sovereignty, then you should already be worried, because the very fact of freezing those assets is already infringing on Russian sovereign rights over those assets. I'd also argue that the markets have already taken this into consideration. But I think the most important point that we're trying to make here is that we can link the use of those assets to the damages caused by Russia.
Let me, for a short moment, come back to the situation on the ground, because I've been to Kyiv just a few weeks ago, and there is always a question that I'm being asked by Ukrainians. Why, for how long is Europe going just to do more of the same? Keeping the self-imposed red lines, for example, like Taurus missiles in Germany. We've seen initiatives by the so-called coalition of the willing, but now we hear practically nothing of those countries, no new initiatives. So it is obvious that the West is not doing enough to stop this war. Okay, Ukraine has its own problems with mobilization. That's a different issue. But we're talking about the West. What do you think is keeping countries like Germany, so leading European countries, with their hands tied and those self-imposed red lines, as I've said? Do you think it's Donald Trump or is it Vladimir Putin?
That's a very good question. No, I think it's ourselves. And a very human tendency of postponing difficult decisions to as far into the future as possible. And the reason why Estonia has been faster in that regard, and why we have imposed no restrictions on the weapons that we deliver, is not because of our greater wisdom. We don't claim to that. And it's not because of geographic proximity to the fighting, because as I said earlier, the front lines in Ukraine are geographically as far from Tallinn as they are from Berlin. It is because of our closer proximity to the catastrophes of the 20th century. Anybody who's older than 35, 40 years old remembers occupation firsthand. And that occupation was the direct result of
It's a fresher memory.
It's a fresher memory. And that occupation was a direct result of the catastrophe of the Second World War. So we know that the option of buying yourself stability by feeding the aggressor the freedom of others leads to nothing but catastrophe. And we know this not from history books. We remember it. Again, as I said, anybody who's older than 40. So certain things are easier explained to an audience that has fresher memory in Eastern Europe than it is to explain in societies that are more detached time-wise from the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century. That's the only difference. Other than that, it's just the human nature. You postpone the difficult decisions. I think we also need to consider human nature when analyzing Russia. Pain, people can take, a lot of pain, for as long as they believe that pain to be temporary in nature. That's what we need to change. The Russians need to understand that the pain that they're experiencing, economic pain primarily, is not temporary in nature. Once we manage to do that, I'm convinced there will be change in Moscow, change of course.
Christian, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so first of all, I subscribe fully to what Jonatan just said about, let's say, the imagination. What is most important about Germany is it's not that we have been not only in a different position, but there is an own German narrative about how to read our history with the Soviet Union and with Russia. So this is not a vacuum. There is an existing narrative that has informed generations of politicians until today, with many false comparisons, because the Cold War is not what we are seeing here. We are seeing currently a hot war, but people are making this kind of comparison that you can try and treat the Russians like the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And this is a very tough thing, because now you're asking the politicians to go into risk, be it on very special cases like the frozen assets, but in general. And do you get the kind of the benefit of the doubt by the people? Yes, you have. And this is the interesting thing is the German public is, I would say, no longer the problem. The bigger problem is the political Berlin, in which you still have people who have built their political career on these wrong narratives. Nobody cared about these wrong narratives for such a long time, but now they have become significantly important. And the question is, how do you basically circumvent these people? This is an infight still going on within the parliament, where you try to get these people out of powerful positions. and also within government. So the Foreign Office is a social organization that has its own social memory. So finding something now right that you have since years defined as being wrong on the legal side, so I'm talking about the frozen assets here, is a rather complicated thing. So you see that the German government currently is trying to find its kind of sustainable political positions and sustainable political course, but we are still not there. The Foreign Office, not the minister, but the kind of the administrative body sometimes really comes up with strange ideas, or with surprising ideas, one would say. The good thing is that you currently have a chancellor who is really willing to make a difference, and also willing to make a difference in security and defense, and leading this from the first moment on. Doesn't mean that this cannot go wrong, right? This is so every encouraging signal, I think, is one we should really take forward. But it's also a need for, I would say, for guidance, because Germany has never been in a leadership position. We never led Europe, but we can still help Europe significantly. And we are looking into a future where Germany, with a lot of potential and resources, now basically is willing to help. And this also needs then a new way of defining cooperation with our partners here. So show us how we can basically use our muscles best in what we are all basically up for, making Europe more secure. This is basically now I would say now is the time to do it, and not next year. It's now, basically, because the main decisions about the future course of Germany and therefore of Europe are taken now by this government.
And also, I mean, the entire situation also has a very big risk that Europeans are navel-gazing and missing out on, the bigger world and other conflicts. And this is something that Michaela addressed. Michaela Kufner, who all our regular Berlin Briefing listeners and viewers are very familiar with. She went to the press conference given by General Secretary Mark Rutte from NATO, who was in Berlin this week. And she asked him an interesting question.
Secretary General, to you the question. You've made quite a stir by referencing to World War III and drawing a scenario which would see simultaneous attacks by Russia and China. Is that just one NATO scenario? How likely is it? And historians are often stressing that it's hard to tell when you actually enter a war. So are you already seeing the precursor of that?
We've had, and of course, what we know from our sources, that the risk is increasingly there that Xi Jinping, the president of China and General Secretary of the Communist Party, before he would attack Taiwan, will first make a call into Moscow, his very junior partner in all of this, one Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, to ask him to keep us busy in this part of Europe. And this shows you that the transatlantic and the Indo-Pacific are getting more and more intertwined, already through North Korea participating in the war of aggression against Ukraine on the Russian side, including China with sanction circumvention and with dual-use goods delivered into Russia, supporting Russia's war effort in Ukraine. And of course Iran with its drone technology. So this is all getting more and more interconnected.
So Jonatan, many people in Europe are discussing a scenario where Russian efforts in Europe would be intensified so that China has a bit of more legroom essentially to embark on its efforts when it comes to Taiwan, etc. One scenario is that the Russians would target Narva, which is in Estonia. How worried are the people in Narva?
I was just in Narva a few weeks ago, actually. I like to take my visitors, if they have time, to Narva, to show them a town that really is not worried. I mean, it's a small town, a very small town. Our third largest, but by European standards, a very, very small town. It's very, very peaceful and calm. I dare to even say, to an extent, boring, except for the fact that there's a border. And when you visit the border, then on the border, there are two medieval castles, very different looking medieval castles. Making a point clearly that this has been a border of civilizations not since 1918 when we gained our independence, but for centuries. So obviously we prepare We are focused. We are not naive. We've lived next to Russia for as long as there has been a Russia, and we will continue to live next to Russia once this war is over. We've learned from our history that nothing is to be taken for granted. Nothing. We, alongside the Latvians and Lithuanians, were the only 3 members of the League of Nations in the 1930s that did not become founding members of the United Nations, because we were totally wiped off the map. Now, many found themselves under communist dictatorships or Moscow domination. We were destroyed in our totality. So everything can change. Nothing is to be taken for granted. And then our re-emergence in 1991 and our joining of NATO and the European Union, our building up of a truly significant digital state is proof that also everything is possible.
Yeah, we're very jealous of that.
So, everybody's happy, welcome to visit. Look at how we do it. None of this is cutting edge technologically. It's fairly cutting edge legislatively, if you know what I mean. So we're focused. We prepare. We're very comfortable with the level of deterrence that we now have, both in terms of our own capabilities, but also in terms of NATO collective activities. We have British, French soldiers in Estonia. We have obviously German soldiers in Lithuania. We have now Finland and Sweden solidly in NATO. And if you look at the Nordic Baltic states together, we are roughly the size of Poland population-wise. There's absolutely no daylight between our positions on the matters that matter, European security, Russia. When you compare our positions to Polish positions, exactly the same on the matters that matter. And if you add Poland to the Nordic Baltic, we're roughly the size of Germany. And when I listen to what the German leaders are saying, then frankly, I mean, it's as if I'm listening to another Estonian or a Swede or a Finn. It's just simply so similar. And when you add the German population to the group, it's 160 million people. 160 million people. And we're trying to help the 30, 40 million Ukrainians defeat the 140 million Russians. It's doable. It's doable. And part of what we have going against us is this lack of strategic culture in Europe. For 80 years, we haven't done this for obvious reasons. I mean, I'm not going to explain the history. And now all of a sudden we find ourselves in a situation where we need to demonstrate leadership. We need to be the ones coming up with ideas, not the Americans. We need to be able to not only explain how we're going to get to an end of the fighting, but also how we're going to go beyond that. Because once the war is over, history won't be over. There will still be a requirement for some sort of a security mechanism to guarantee Ukraine's existence, political stability, economic viability. Eventually, NATO and EU membership are the best solutions for that, but there will be a time in between where we will have to come up with some sort of a European policy to do all of this and then get the others to join, the Americans, the Canadians, but also our friends from Asia. When you listen to the Japanese, when you listen to the South Koreans, the way they describe the importance of the war in Ukraine, it's as if you're listening to another Estonian again. So we need to be the ones coming up with these policies and then getting the others to join, not the other way around. And this is a challenge for a continent that has the history that it has and the lacking institutions and traditions that we have. But no alternative.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to continue this conversation for a couple of hours, but of course that is going to then turn into a very long YouTube video, and we will have to stop it here. But I'd like to invite you all back again, because of course it's not the last time that we're going to analyse what's going on and try and predict the future and discuss all the various challenges that we're facing when it comes to Russia's war against Ukraine. But we've also produced episodes in the past on this topic. So do go to our playlist on YouTube. You'll find us there every week. We also are on all the major podcast platforms. Just look for DW Berlin Briefing. And we've got a weekly newsletter that focuses on the German perspective on all relevant things happening around the world, but also on discussions going on here in this country. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thanks
and to all of you out there.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.